Now let's consider elasticity, taxes, and the size of the deadweight loss. So we're going to have two markets, right? The equilibrium price, P star, is the same in both. All that's different in these two markets is the level of elasticity. So in the dark green curves on the left, we see a really steep supply curve and a really steep demand curve, which means the steepness reflect very inelastic supply and inelastic demand. On the right, in sort of that dark bluish, slatish blue color, we see two really flat curves, a flat supply curve and a flat demand curve, and that reflects a pretty elastic supply and elastic demand. So all that's different between those two is the relative elasticity. Now drawing in a PB, right, a price that the buyers pay from a tax, and a lower price that the sellers receive, PS, we put in a tax wedge and we carry that same amount across to both markets. Let's look at the difference in impact from the same level of tax. All that's different is the amount of elasticity in the market. So how big is the deadweight loss going to be? On the left, you see the size of the triangle is sort of this skinny little wedge, so a small area of deadweight loss, right, moving from the equilibrium quantity to where the price wedge is sort of vertically intersecting the supply and the demand curve. Whereas in the supply and demand curve that are elastic, the market on the right, the area of tax creates a much larger deadweight loss. Let's look at why, right? So what determines the deadweight loss of a tax? Well, it's really two things. One, it's the size of the tax, right? So a bigger tax per unit, a bigger wedge, right? Bigger gap between PB and PS creates more deadweight loss. It's also based on the amount of elasticity in the market. When there's a lot of elasticity, really flat curves, we have a large deadweight loss. And when we have very inelastic curves, so very steep supply and demand curves, we have a smaller amount of deadweight loss. Well, which side of the market bears more of the tax burden? And when economists refer to tax burden, they're talking about who is feeling the real economic pain from a tax, who is losing more surplus. Economists are not talking about who's having the tax assessed on them. It's not who sends the check, a tax on the buyers or a tax on the sellers. It really depends on the relative elasticity, right? So it's not whether it's assessed on the buyers or the sellers. It's based on the relative elasticity, because the true pain of the tax is based on the amount of surplus that's being lost. So let's look at that graphically. So here we have a market where the demand curve is really steep, so inelastic demand, and we have a flatter supply curve. So notice already that before we even draw any tax wedge in there, that we have a lot of consumer surplus and not so much producer surplus, right? The area above the price line is much greater. So inelastic demand and a lot of consumer surplus. When we put in a given amount of tax wedge, right, who's going to lose more surplus? Well, that upper triangle and rectangle area, right, the consumer area that's lost is much greater than that lower area that's still being taken away from the producers but isn't nearly as big. So the demand side loses more because the demand side is inelastic. Let's look at it if we drew it the other way around. What if the supply side was inelastic? And we've got a pretty big tax, and it's not the consumers that are feeling the pain, it is the producers, because in this case, the supply curve is steep. The supply is relatively inelastic. And so whenever a tax is levied in a market on a good, on a per unit basis, the more inelastic side of the market feels more of the pain. It's not who sends the check. It's which side of the market is more inelastic. They're the ones that bear more of the tax burden.